Hi guys, Mark here once again. It's a beautiful sunny day, so I'm sat in my garden shooting this video, so please forgive me that luxury. But I wanted to do this video because I want to get a point out, I want to get an opinion out, and I want to clarify something. But first, I want to challenge you. And here's the challenge. If you think that what I'm going to be saying in this video is in any way illegal, sue me. Okay? There you go. Simple. So watch the video all the way through, and if you think that what I'm saying is illegal, take me to court and sue me, and let's have our day in court, because I think this thing needs to be talked about, and it needs to be talked about in a holistic and a sophisticated way. And the subject I want to touch on is the issue of pain compliance techniques, especially with the use of children, because on the 30th of June Community Care published an article that said that an organisation is looking to make the use of any pain compliance technique with a child illegal. That's their drive. Okay, now I get why they're doing it, because people have been trying to do this for years, and they're well-meaning people, and they want to look after vulnerable children. They have the best interest of the child at heart, and I get it. Okay, but you're misguided, because actually in some circumstances, if you ban the use of a restrictive intervention that may or may not cause discomfort, harm or pain, in certain circumstances you cannot be acting with the best interest of the child, and I'll come back to that later on. Firstly, let's talk about the language, shall we? Because I think the language is emotive, and that's what's causing the issue. The words pain compliance probably date way back to the 80s, the 1980s, and they probably have its roots in prison service training. Because I'm an ex-prison officer, and I've worked with young offenders, and we were trained to do the control and restraint program, and as part of that program we were taught pain compliance techniques, and we were trained that if someone wasn't complying, and we had to control them, particularly if they were very strong, very violent, and there was a risk to them and us, that we could use legitimately techniques that would intentionally induce pain to control that person. Now, we're nearly 30, 40 years on from then, so let's change the narrative. You know, let's bring this up to date. Why aren't we talking about restrictive techniques? Because honestly, I believe that the vast majority of people out there do not go out there intentionally to cause pain to children. That's not on their mind. They don't want to do that. You know, most of them are acting in the best interests of the children in their care, because some of these children need serious care. They're hurting themselves very, very badly, and I'll come on to a case in a minute, but they're also posing a risk to staff. And if you ban these techniques, in certain circumstances, the risk will increase. So I think we need to bring the language up to date first and foremost, and we're talking about the use of restrictive interventions that may or may not cause discomfort, harm or pain. So let's just update the narrative. I think that's one thing we can all do, because anytime those words are mentioned, pain compliance, people think that people are going out there to whack wrist lock some, to hurt people intentionally, and I don't think that's the case. Now, the argument put forward in the article is that pain compliance techniques, or any technique that causes discomfort, harm or pain to a child, should be made illegal. And they're referring to two documents in the report there, which I may or may not speak about later on. But in relation to one of the documents that was produced, that came from the Restraint Advisory Board, that document is now 6 years old. It was produced in 2011. But I was invited to a meeting of the next group that was set up after the Restraint Advisory Board, which was the Independent Restraint Advisory Panel, that was chaired by a Professor Sue Bailey, Professor Dame Sue Bailey, I believe her correct title is. Now, whilst I was there, I was asked the question whether the use of a pain compliance technique with a child was illegal, and I said no. And I was challenged by the panel on this, who said I was wrong. So I actually went to a barrister. There's a document here, and I actually asked the barrister for their opinion, and I laid all the evidence before them. And in the summary of this letter here, the barrister states this. It says, I agree with the statement, the use of pain compliant techniques for children is illegal, was wrong. There you go. A barrister is saying that the statement made by the panel, chaired by Dame Professor Sue Bailey, was wrong. So when they said, just to clarify, when they said that the use of pain compliance techniques with children is illegal, they were wrong. But here's the frightening thing. That's quite a, that's quite an informative panel. They have a lot of influence and they have a lot of weight, and they were going to produce a report. And we had to go to a barrister, who, by the way, someone who's legally qualified and competent to comment, to prove that what they were saying was wrong. Now, this is my concern. When these groups get themselves set up, or these well-meaning parties set themselves up, I get it. I get that they want to look after children. I get that they have the best interest of children at heart. But they're trying to ban something, but on the basis of the fact that they actually don't understand what they're talking about, particularly when it comes to the use of force. So there's my first bone of contention. Let's look at the alternative options to pain compliance. Okay, mechanical restraint. Have talk about handcuffs, shall we? Now, I know, even as I mentioned that, people who do not want restrictive techniques used on children will have jumped up in horror, probably put their head in their hands. But a mechanical restraint has its place. It's the least intrusive option. It can stop someone from harming themselves and others. There's another option, prone restraint. Let's put someone face down on the floor and hold them there, because you can do that with not too much pain. You just use pressure, and pressure's probably all right. But interestingly enough, the Department of Health Positive and Safe document that came out in 2014 says we should not control people in a prone face down position on any surface, not just the floor. So how do you stop people going to the floor? And the reason they want to stop people going to the floor, by the way, is because they die there. Okay? There's evidence that people can die if they're restrained on the floor in certain positions in certain ways. So how can you stop someone going to the floor? Use a restrictive technique. So my question is this: if we knew that someone was at risk of dying from a particular restraint position in a particular way, would the use of another intervention, maybe one, a restricted one, that could possibly cause discomfort, harm or pain, be justified legally in preventing a death? That's a no-brainer, isn't it, really? And in fact, these organisations and government panels who talk about not wanting to cause pain to children, they also should realise that they have to comply with Article 2(1) of the Human Rights Act. And Article 2, brackets 1, promotes the positive obligation to preserve life. And what that means to us in our world, when we're talking about physical intervention or restraint or control restraint, whatever you want to call it, is that if we know that there is a position that increases the risk of death, then we are absolutely obliged by law to do something to stop that position being used. So here's my question. If we knew that someone could go to the floor, and we could prevent that by using a restrictive technique, one that might cause discomfort, harm or pain, but save their life, we're complying with the Human Rights Act. How is that illegal? But my other question is this: if you take away that option from staff and someone dies, who's in the frame? The organisation for banning the technique, or the commissioning agency for taking their advice? I'll come on to that later. Now, I mentioned Article 2 of the Human Rights Act, so let's talk about Article 3, because I know someone will bring that up. Article 3 is the prohibition of torture and inhumane and degrading treatment or punishment. So, if we use a restrictive intervention, one that might cause discomfort, harm or pain, are we intentionally torturing someone? Are we actually using an inhumane and degrading way of actually restraining someone? Well, the answer to that is no, particularly not if it's consistent with Article 2(1) of the Human Rights Act, and where we're acting in the best interest of a service user or child. It can't be. I mean, the threshold for proving a case against Article 3 is extremely high. You know, you've got to do some serious torturing and treat people in a very inhumane and degrading way for Article 3 to kick in. But I hear all the time that so if you use a technique that causes pain, it's torture. No, it's not. If that's the case, then my bloody dentist is guilty of torture every time I see him, because he causes me a serious amount of pain. Okay, legislation-wise, if you're watching this, but if you think I'm wrong, sue me. For Christ's sake, please sue me. I'm happy days with that one. But we get this stuff come out, and it's dangerous. The stuff that some of these people are producing is dangerous because they don't understand the legal underpinning, and that's the important factor. Now, when Sir Herbert Laming, who is now Lord Laming, was at the time the Commissioner for the Social Services Inspectorate, he was involved in a document to give guidance on what staff could and couldn't do when trying to comply with the Children's Act in relation to restraint. And one of the comments made was that the primary piece of legislation that relates to children and the use of force with children is the Children's Act 1989. But that document went on to say that the common law position and the criminal law relating to the use of force will also be relevant. So you can't just ban law. You can't do it. The law exists for everyone. Let's say you have a large 15-year-old boy, okay, powerful, probably fitter and stronger, and there's more energy than the staff looking after him. So demographically, we have service users or patients or children in school that are fitter and stronger than the persons who are looking after them. How is a strong 15-year-old boy who may weigh, say, 13 stone going to be restrained by two members of staff, probably maybe in their 30s, 40s, even older, who are carrying injuries, who maybe not at their peak of fitness? Effectively, how's it going to happen if you ban restrictive interventions? Because here's the other side of the argument. You know, there's a duty of care to service users and patients, and they are vulnerable people and they should be looked after with the greatest of care. But you've also got a duty of care to staff. And if you take away this option, then what are you left with? Well, the only place, probably, in a serious intervention it's going to go to is to the ground. And we've already discussed that, okay? Or you're going to get people hurt. Which brings me on to another point to raise. What well-meaning people who come up with these ideas forget to understand is the whole aspect of the science and psychology around how people react in use of force situations. Well, the average human being, within 2 to 12 seconds, is in oxygen deficit. That means their body is using up oxygen greater than it can produce it, which means that they haven't got long to do something. And in a heightened stress environment, if they're running out of breath, their heart rate will go up. And if their heart rate goes up, other things happen. Their hearing's affected. Their vision is affected. They've basically, if we're not careful, end up with a frontal lobe lobotomy, and they work from the limbic system, which means they can't think and act in the best interests of anyone, because we're not allowing them to do so. So there's another aspect that we need to think of. Okay, let's come at this from a best interest criteria now. Now we know that in law, under the Children's Act and the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, that we must at all times promote the best interest of the child, and that must be at the forefront of our mind in all dealings with children. That's what the law says. Okay? How, then, can you act in the child's best interest if you take away something that could work in the best interest of the child? And I'll tell you what else will happen here as well. If staff and organisations fear that they're going to be disciplined or sanctioned or have warning notices put on them by inspectorates that may not know what they're talking about, then you won't have a best interest criteria. You'll have organisations and staff acting with a self-interest criteria. They'll be acting just so that they do what these people want them to do, so they can tick a box to say, we no longer use any restrictive technique that might cause discomfort, harm or pain. And that's kept the inspectors happy. Unfortunately, we've got staff getting battered, and we've got children now at risk who are getting more serious injuries. So I think this whole thing about best interest criteria needs to be looked at more holistically. Otherwise, as I've said already, it becomes a self-interest criteria. Okay, now let's look at this from a safeguarding point of view. Well, we all know that we have a duty to actually protect vulnerable children and adults at risk. Well, if we don't give staff the ability, the tools to do their job properly, and we take something away from them that could be effective in certain situations, then we are creating adults at risk. That's a safeguarding issue for staff. So we can come at that from a safeguarding angle too, if you like, and any of you safeguarding professionals out there want to comment on this, I'd welcome your comments. Because, you know, we're placing an adult at risk, which also increases the risk to the vulnerable child. Because they're being given a system or techniques that won't work in extreme and exceptional circumstances. So, from a safeguarding point of view, we've increased the risk to children and adults. Okay, let's talk about willful neglect. This is a new piece of legislation that's come out, And basically, organisations and individuals can be prosecuted where they fail to care for someone they're supposed to look after, willfully. So let's say that you as an organisation decide to take away techniques that, if they were used, would have prevented serious harm or death to someone. And you make that decision. That is a willful decision. And as far as I'm concerned, you willfully neglected the care of people in your care by taking a proactive decision to actually remove these techniques. Now, as far as I'm aware, this new piece of legislation carries, quite a heavy fine, and I believe a prison sentence too. Let's look at corporate manslaughter. There's another piece of legislation that you can be hit on the head with. If someone dies in your care because of inappropriate or ineffective physical intervention techniques, where, once again, the use of those techniques could have prevented someone being, from dying in your organisation, then you can be charged with gross negligence manslaughter, and the organisation can be charged with corporate manslaughter, and it won't be hard to prove, I don't think, because someone will have had to make a decision at board level, I presume, that they didn't want those techniques in because someone didn't like them. Now, if you're making a decision on this, that you took them away because you just didn't like them because that person who wrote that report said so, how are you going to evidence that in a court of law? Where's your justification? Where's your, what they call now, cogent reasons for actually making your case? I don't think you'll have any legs to stand on, to be perfectly honest with you. I think you're walking on very, very thin ice, and you've got to be very, very careful. Now, I just want to put a disclaimer in here as well, because there'll be someone out there going, oh, it's him again, he's talking about pain compliance techniques, he loves pain compliance techniques, he likes to bend people up and hurt them. No, I don't. I don't at all. I've spent a lifetime teaching this stuff to stop people being seriously hurt and killed, genuinely. And virtually everyone I train is the same. In fact, we've even thrown people off courses who've made inappropriate comments because they're not fit and proper people to be teaching this stuff. We'll remove them from training and we'll remove their accreditation. So let's just get this point right. I am not into hurting children or anyone. That's not what I'm about. It's not what our organisation is about, and it's certainly not what the trainers we are about train with. We're into protecting people, and I'm into doing it properly. Now, the reason I'm doing this video is because I'll go to court with you. If we train you, I'll go to court with you and I'll say, yes, we taught that for these reasons. I can provide you with the cogent reasons as to why you need to use those techniques. We've got risk assessments, legal audits, everything that will go with this, medical reviews, to say why we do what we do. Now, if you're an organisation that's also doing good behavioural care planning and your restraint risk assessments on an individual basis, as you should be now, then you will also have the evidence to know what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. And if you don't need to use a restrictive intervention, one that might cause discomfort, harm or pain, don't use it. There are other options out there. But if we're getting to serious restraint issues, we're getting to high levels of violence, then a restrictive intervention that might cause discomfort, harm or pain may have to be our only option in those extreme circumstances. Now, should they be monitored? Absolutely. Should restraint be supervised? Absolutely. Should there be post-incident debriefing? Absolutely. So I think that's a really, really important issue. Now, here's a cracker. This is one I hear all the time. Normally from therapists. They say we're not into using physical intervention in any way, shape or form because it will damage the therapeutic relationship with our client or service user. Really? What a crock. When I worked as a prison officer, I restrained lots and lots of people, okay? Young offenders, that's where I worked. Did it damage my relationship with them? No. Maybe one or two didn't like me, but we soon built bridges because that's what you do. Okay, if you're acting in someone's best interest, you always go in and you do a post-incident debrief and you involve the person that's being restrained. That's what we did, and I know that goes on now. So, all this stuff about we don't do it because it damages the therapeutic relationship with the person we're using it on. Seriously, think about your therapy, okay? Because it's not. And also, what you're doing by making that ridiculous statement is you're saying, you're a good guy because you don't want to damage a therapeutic relationship with that person. Therefore, by default, the staff must not be good people because they're using restraint, and therefore they cannot have a relationship with the person they're restraining. You need to get this in your head. Those staff are working with those people all the time, and you as a therapist may turn up once a week or whenever you turn up to do your 1 hour slot, you know, and you don't want to damage that 1 hour relationship. You know, I think you need to be very careful what you're saying with that one, because I would find that offensive. And here's another angle I want to come in on as well. I mean, you know, you're looking to ban a restrictive intervention because you feel that it could be used in an abusive way, or that it is being used in an abusive way. Okay, now that could happen. I'm not going to paint a whiter than white picture here. That could happen. But what are management doing about it? Because any intervention must be managed. Staff should be debriefed. I've said all this already. So if managers know that they shouldn't be doing that, then that member of staff needs to be called into line. They need to be interviewed. They need to be debriefed. We need to find out why. You don't just let a system run. It has to be managed. So the training is only one part of the whole. You've got policy, procedure, you've got debrief and supervision. All those things must come together. Now, if you are saying that you need to remove techniques that might cause discomfort, harm or pain because they're being used badly, then I think you need to look at the way management is managing and staff are being supervised, which is a health and safety issue. It's also a safeguarding issue. And if that's not happening, you potentially got willful neglect. So there's another area we need to look at. Okay, but I'm going to humour you for a minute. Let's say we all agree that we should ban any restrictive intervention that might cause discomfort, harm or pain. Please tell me what you're going to replace it with. Okay? What's the alternative? Considering the demographic makeup of staff and service users, the difference in variation in age and sex and size and injuries and capabilities or lack of, what are you going to replace it with? If you can answer that question, and it will work as a skill, and by the way, you know, understand the definition of skill before you answer that question. If you can do that, great, we have a solution. If you can't, then why are you banging on about removing something that works? You're disabling staff and you're placing people, staff and service users, vulnerable service users, at extreme risk, which is why I'm going to say again, you know, this is all really well-meaning, absolutely well-meaning, but there's no substance to it, and it's not been thought through in a sophisticated way, and it's not holistic. Right, I just want to share this with you. This is some correspondence that I had from Ofsted in relation to questions I asked them. And here's the first question. Yeah, I asked, what specific training do Ofsted inspectors receive in relation to the use of force, physical restraint, as part of Ofsted's statutory requirement to ensure that Ofsted inspectors are both qualified and competent in being able to assess any use of force or restraint training or activity within the organisations and schools that its inspectors inspect to a professionally competent standard. Answer: we do not train our inspectors in restraint techniques, and it is not for our inspectors to assess the training that a provider chooses to commission. There you go. They don't train them. And it's down to you as a provider to ensure that you choose the right training. Now, I know that some local education authorities believe that you can only use a particular training provider because they are in some way government endorsed or preferred or whatever. Okay, I wrote to the Secretary of State for Education, and the response I got from the Secretary of State's office was that it is the responsibility and accountability of the head teacher of every school to decide what training is fit and proper for their particular school. The government do not endorse anything and will not endorse anything. Now, to give you another idea, I wrote to Ofsted again on a separate issue. This was to do with the locking of a door. But the point of this bit of correspondence is to ask Ofsted if they would take responsibility and accountability for any advice and guidance they gave, because at the time they were saying you couldn't lock a door. So this is the answer, or this is the question, sorry. Is Ofsted willing to accept full responsibility and accountability under a non-delegable duty of care to any harm that may come to a child that could have been prevented by the temporary locking of a door? Answer from Ofsted: the legal position is clear that it is the responsibility of the provider of a children's home to operate within the regulatory regime. Ofsted will accept no such responsibility and accountability which may be alleged to stem from the carrying out of its statutory duties of regulating children's homes, which involves ensuring that breaches of the relevant regulations are identified and drawn to the attention of the provider. Okay, now I'm not a rocket scientist and I'm not an academic, But if you, Ofsted, are not training people in the competencies and the qualifications that they need to have to actually be able to go in to understand why a particular restraint technique was used from a range of competent reasons, why then are they going in and saying that you can't do stuff? You know, most organisations now have more qualified staff in that area than Ofsted does. And I'm using Ofsted as an example because I have the correspondence from there. But last week, or the week before, sorry, I was with an ex-CQC inspector, and I asked the same question. I said, what training did you get when you joined CQC in relation to understanding the use of force and restraint techniques, physical intervention, position asphyxiation? They went, none whatsoever. We're just told to go out and interpret the standards. They said some people may have done training courses, but then again they'll have a bias towards a particular system because that's where they've come from. But there is no overall training. Now, if you're giving advice, guidance and information, or you're going to enforce or endorse something, then you must have the qualification and competence to do so. Otherwise, you're breaking the law. Read Article 13 of the European Convention of Human Rights. There's been cases where advice has been given and action has been taken on that advice that was wrong, and then people have been compensated as a result. So I just wanted to make that point very, very clear, because with regards to this whole issue of banning certain techniques or making them illegal and unlawful, I don't think you're coming at this from a holistic perspective at all. Right, so there you go. I've said my piece. There's probably a lot more I could say, but I'm not going to at the moment. But I've said my piece on this. You know, I think that the direction these people want to take is well-meaning, but I think it's hugely misguided. Probably they're either getting the wrong advice or they're not competent in this area to understand where they're coming from. And I think if you ban certain techniques or try and ban them, and in fact I don't think you will ban them, I don't think they can be banned, not legally anyway. They might be banned in a guidance document, but the law can't ban them. You know, I think you're taking a dangerous step. You're leaving people at risk, including the vulnerable children that you're intending to protect. Because if staff do not have the capabilities, skills, the tools to do the job, then they can't be expected to actually look after those people properly, and it places staff at risk too. Now, I set a challenge at the beginning of this video. If you think I'm wrong, sue me. I'm happy, you know, happy days. I will gladly go to any court and answer any questions on this. So if you think that any of the advice I give in this video about the use of restrictive techniques or the old name pain compliance techniques is wrong, illegal in any way, shape or form, please sue me. You know, take me to court. Ofsted, CQC, you know, there's an open invitation for you. You know, I mean, you know, I'm willing to stand the line on this one. Thanks ever so much for listening. Speak to you soon.